Thank you for coming. Welcome. Thank you for coming to the Asian American Authors Book Club, the first inaugural event. Welcome. And thanks for coming. There's a lot of hard work behind our brain trust between Betty and Connie and Cal and Carl and Earl and all these people that are the nature to help us put this together. Our purpose is to elevate Asian Americans' narrative and to promote us and also want to own our narrative to the country, right? So by doing that, we want to promote more Asian American authors who are successful in sharing their stories. The stories are important, right? So tonight we have a very good fortune to have Qian Julie Wang, who is really amazing New York Times bestselling author. Her book was number 3 on New York Times bestselling list, a few months ago, and she was on the Today Show for twice, interviewed by Jenna Bush as the choice of her book club. And her book also got selected by the New York Times 100 most notable books last month. Well, imagine we have about 2 million books being published a year. Her book's being named as one of the 100 top books in the world. And so this is her first book, by the way. So I want you to join me in giving her a big warm welcome to Qian Julie Wang. Let's go.
It's so wonderful to see you all here tonight. Thank you so much for making time, and thank you, Betty and Savio, for organizing this wonderful event.
Thank you. So Betty, it's your turn now. Your turn to ask the good question.
Yeah, sure. Well, Qian Julie, I've really enjoyed getting to know you during the time that we've been coordinating this inaugural event. You are clearly a diversity and inclusion champion. And Beautiful Country and the work that you've done more broadly truly demonstrates that. For many of us, myself included, our work has been informed by what I call a journey of going from pain to purpose and then promise. Promise meaning those solutions that we feel will really make an impact. I would really love for you to share your own story in terms of your from pain to purpose and promise journey and how Beautiful Country fits into that narrative. And how is Beautiful Country really part of that promise?
I love that idea of pain to purpose to promise. And it took me a very long time to understand that so long as I was in pain and rejecting that pain and unable to process it, I would not be of any service to anyone else. Those of you who have already read my book know that I decided at the ripe old age of 9 that I wanted to go to law school and be the next Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Thurgood Marshall. But upon graduating from law school, I very quickly realized that whenever I was doing public interest work, and I interned in many different places, including legal aid, it hit too close to home for me to be near the same type of poverty and struggle and immigration barriers that I myself lived. I felt the burden of the world was on me and I just could not do it. And it wasn't until I took the time to recognize and honor the wounds, the very deep wounds I was still carrying within me, that I realized that as long as I was hurting, I was not going to be of benefit to anyone else. And Beautiful Country is really my reclaiming my life, my power and my voice and identity from the secrets and shame of my past, from almost 20 some years of telling myself I was not worthy, I was illegal, I was bad. And I think that it is when we bear our own vulnerability and tell our own stories that we give permission to others to find their voice and bear their own vulnerabilities and find their power. And so I hope this is the beginning of my attempting to do that, to show the world that we can all be healed in community and in coalition with each other.
So what advice would you give new authors, people like he want to write books for themselves to share their story? Mm-hmm. And they think that my story is not as good as your story. So they feel that, this imposter syndrome, what would you tell them to share their stories if they feel their story is not good enough to share to the world?
Number one, if you feel that you are an imposter, that's a good sign. That means you are human and that you're an artist. And secondly, if you feel that your story might not be worth telling, that means your story is not out there in the world, right? If every story out there was like yours, then maybe your story wouldn't be so interesting. But the fact that people might think, well, my story is not as good as that story, and I'm seeing that one out there, that is singular proof that your story needs to be told because it has not yet been told. And the way in which you experience life, the way in which you can tell others about that experience is yours and uniquely yours. It's not anybody else's. And so that empowers each person here, each person who thinks that they might have a book in them, to have that unique voice. And I just hope that you remember every time you feel self-doubt and you question yourself that every one of us struggles with that. And I, to this day, struggle with that. But the key there is to forge forward and understand that your story is your own and worth putting out there in the world.
So storytelling is very powerful. And I'd really love for you to share your perspectives on storytelling and the critical role of storytelling in actually tackling racism and prejudice that we know is out there.
It's very easy to empathize with stories and people who are mirrored to us through media. Unfortunately, all too often, that's one type of person and one type of story that we see. And there's a particular gap, I think, in media of Asian American stories, immigrant stories, undocumented immigrant stories. And as such, it is very easy for those stories and those people who are not represented to be dehumanized, to be painted with a broad brush, and to be treated like stereotypes. So holding up unique stories to the light, showing that we are all different, just one Asian American cannot be replaceable for another one, that our heritage and our culture is rich and diverse and dimensional. That is crucial. People are really easy to judge from afar, but they're impossible to hate up close. You can't get to know someone intimately without seeing some of yourself reflected in them, no matter their race, no matter their immigration status, no matter their sexual orientation. And that's why stories of all kinds need to be out there, need to be embraced by our mainstream culture. And I think in America, we have a long ways to go on that front.
What are your thoughts? Do you have suggestions regarding how can we broaden the reach and impact of diverse stories?
There is such a tendency to pigeonhole stories. I mean, the number of times I have sat on a panel with other women of color has been 99.9% of times I've done events, it's been with other women of color. One time I was on a panel with a white man who was an author, and he was an author of a children's book. And so long as we are kind of cabined off to our own silo, we're not going to get our voices to the spaces that need it the most. And so the fact that you have organized this event here at a landmark bookstore, actually this is a bookstore that's very special to me in my heart because I used to come here when I came back to New York City from law school, so it's swing by. And what Jenna Bush did by picking my book, and I'm just extremely fortunate that it happened that way, catapult stories that are, yes, representative of certain cultures and heritages and races, but also talk about a universal humanity. And that's not just my book. There are a lot of books that have been pigeonholed as only Asian American that have a lot to say about what it's like to be a person in the world and don't just apply to being Asian. And that tendency to categorize really, I think, harms society and deprives a lot of readers from stories that are important to receive.
Well, writing a book is like a black box, right? People want to write a book, they know how to find an agent, publisher. It's hard there's no menu to do this. How do you find your agent and your publisher? Could you share a little bit of that journey? And when you do that, did you encounter any discriminations about, oh, you're Chinese, we don't need another Chinese book,
Absolutely. So I knew nothing about the publishing industry. I had revered books my whole life. I taught myself English on library books. They were holy to my mind. And the thought that I might be able to create one of my own just to me seemed impossible and almost blasphemous that I could create something so holy. So when I finished the book, I was really in shock. I was more surprised than anyone. And then I realized I didn't know what to do at all. And I was terrified at the idea of sending it out into the world. But I had to. I actually took the week after I finished the first draft to start sending it out to agent because I knew if I let it sit, I would lose my nerve. I would tell myself the same thing you said. My story is not worth telling. Who am I to put this book out in the world? Who am I to be talking to people and publishing? So I Googled literary agent and I just emailed my manuscript out.
How many did you email to?
Oh, in the span of 2 weeks, I probably emailed like 60 to 100 people. There were people who responded saying, I don't do adult books. I don't know where you got my information. I really was new and super green. I knew one person who was Hillary Frey. She was at Huffington Post and she put me in touch with my amazing agent Adriana, who's actually over there. And we met, and I met a few other agents who did get back to me through the slush pile, really. And ultimately, I just felt like I had to go with my gut and go with the person who got my vision and understood my story and understood how I wanted to present the story, which is both of an immigrant and an Asian American, but also of an American child. And from there, it was very fortunate. But yes, in the process, I was shocked by some of the business response emails that I got. Agents responded to me saying, we already have an Asian American author, so we don't need another one. Also, do you know her? Is she your sister? And I'm like, if she were my sister, do you think I would be cold emailing you? Like, don't you think I would have mentioned that? And then my agent, Adriana, on submission to publishing houses, also got similar responses. And I'm just shocked that you would put anything like that in a business email, and maybe that's just me as a lawyer, like I'm always thinking about being sued. But it's just silly to put it in writing, even if you're thinking that, right? Like don't let that go through your fingers onto the keyboard and into the email, delete it. But it shows how pervasively white the industry is, and I just love, I didn't respond this way, but when I got that email, I thought, would you ever say that to a white author? How silly would that sound? We already have a white author. We don't need another one. If every agency had one white author, that would be great for the rest of us, but it's unfortunately not how it works. So it was a rude awakening. Like when I was stepping out of the legal industry, I thought I'm set. What could be more backwards than the legal industry? I'm not saying the publishing industry is more backwards, but the systemic barriers definitely translate across fields, and that was a rude awakening for me.
So now you get a great, amazing agent. How do you find the publisher through the agent, right? Just interview all of them?
So Adriana went and sent my book out to 20-some editors. It happened very quickly, and actually Doubleday was the first one to get back to us. We actually sent it out the week of the George Floyd murder, and it was just pandemic. It was a chaotic period. And the book was the last thing I was thinking of because, there were protests, there was a lot going on that was kind of forefront of the mind. And so within days, Doubleday got back to us and said, we love this book and we want to preempt it, which means give you an offer that takes it off the table for the other publishers. And when I spoke to who would be my editor, as well as the publisher, the editor-in-chief of Doubleday, again, I saw that they saw the vision and the storytelling behind Beautiful Country. And I think it's so easy for a lot of people in the industry to cabin stories of people of color and stories of immigrants as just trauma. And that's not really what I try to do. The use of the child's voice, I hoped would illuminate some of the beauty and moments of levity and laughter that my parents really try to inject into a difficult time. And they saw that and they understood that it was at once about immigration, but also about coming of age and about just childhood, just being a kid wandering around trying to figure out your place in the world. And they got all of that. So upon talking to them, I was pretty sold, and I have not regretted my decision. It's been a wonderful place to publish. They also publish Colson Whitehead and a bunch of people way bigger than me. So it's just an honor also to be there.
So it's one thing to be a published author. It's a completely different level to be a New York Times bestselling author. Can you talk a bit about those factors that influenced your success in becoming a New York Times bestselling author?
I'm proud to say the number one factor was luck. I think that when you're transferring industries like I was doing, it's not like I was working in publishing for so long. I didn't understand how connected the world was. And I got very lucky in that I met my agent, Adriana, and we hit it off with Doubleday, and they put all of their resources behind it. And so that would be number two, is the support within your network from your agency and from your publisher. If they believe in the vision, and it's just as likely, I mean, certainly without Adriana, that my book would not have gone to Doubleday and could have landed at a publishing house that didn't quite get it, and it wouldn't have the range of resources that it did. I think also that I was actually shocked that the book was on the list, but I think there is that element of universality and relatability. And I really wanted people, when they opened the book, to feel like they were stepping into my childhood body and experiencing things as myself, and as such see things that were familiar to them because they too experienced a mean teacher or playing a prank on a friend, but then also be open to new experiences, like what it means to be afraid of everybody in uniform. And so in the outpouring of love I've gotten from readers, really humbled by those emails and messages, that is a trend that I found. People have said, oh, you gave life back to when I was a new immigrant. This was exactly how I experienced it. But there were also people who said, I never moved houses growing up, and I still relate to this because I loved Sweet Valley High and Polly Pockets, and that was a big part of my childhood. And so I think being able to tap into that and speak to the heart and people's personal memories, I think was what really allowed me, my book, to reach the audience that it did. But I that's not to say that there aren't many other Asian American books out there that deserve the same level of attention. And last, I would say that I was really fortunate in that I had a lot of time on my feet in the courtroom. Being an author is almost like you have to be two different people. One person has to be able to be alone and just be writing and in solitude for many hours at a time, writing 300 pages. And the other person has to be able to talk to rooms of people, be interviewed, be okay on their feet. And I was fortunate that that second set of skills came to me through being a litigator and being used to being in the courtroom. And it really has served me really well.
So you mentioned Adriana. In your acknowledgments, you list many people who have helped you in your journey. I'd really love for you to talk a bit more about the role of allies in your overall life and career, as well as your journey as an author.
Allies are everything, and they don't necessarily have to look like you, although when they do, that's just so much the better. This book would not exist without my judge, who I mentioned towards the end of the book and in my acknowledgments. She was the very first person I told that I had been undocumented. And as I was doing it, I was thinking, so she was a federal appellate judge. I was thinking, this is the person who literally reviews deportation orders.
Oh, wow.
And after 20 some years, this is the person that you decide to impulsively tell. And she has been my champion since before I told her, but especially after, because part of why I told her was because I felt the story burning inside me with a need to come out, and I didn't know if it was safe to tell it. And she said, at the very least, write it for your future grandchildren. You don't have to publish it. And that kind of gave me the safety she'd be like, oh, no one's going to see this, so I'm just going to try my hand at it.
And now you sold millions of copies.
Well, then I finished writing the manuscript, and she was the first one again that I texted. And I was like, I can't believe I finished it. I'm going to delete it now because I don't want it to be read. And she called me. She's like, I order you not to do it.
A court order not to delete.
Do not delete.
So then she was like, just see what happens. So every step of the way, she really tricked me. But she was the first one to get a finished copy, and she read it. She stayed up at night reading it, read it within 24 hours, and just cried and was so proud. And it was the encouragement of someone like that. And I mean, like countless people. I'm thinking of people at my firm, white men at my firm, who pulled me aside and said, early in my career, you were working way too hard. You got to not work as hard. Here's how your white male associates are being treated, where you are not being treated equally. There are things like that, just allies who point out disparities to me over the course of my career that gave me the sense that I could trust my gut, that I could trust my voice, that I could trust my instincts. And again, like I said, they don't necessarily have to be Asian or people of color. Allies have been everything to me.
So I saw you thank your therapist.
Yeah.
And you have two therapists, not one, in your
I've
acknowledgements.
had more than two.
You have more than two.
Those are my two current.
So talk about how those two therapists or more help you in this journey.
Therapists are very sly, I would say. I'm giving a speech tomorrow, and I just wrote about my first therapy session where I went in and I'm sitting like I'm ready to run out of the door, like holding my purse like this. And I'm like, I'm fine, everything's fine, I don't need anything. It was very clear that I signed up for therapy, so I needed something. And he was like, all right, just let me know when I need to open this door so you can run out without bashing your head into the door. But finding the safety, a safe space and a safe person to tell the stories and secrets that all of us have, that all of us think define us, that have weighed us down for all of our lives, that is really special and rare. And I found that in my judge, and it wasn't her professional job to analyze those secrets, but she gave me the support and safety to then seek further help. And I think that therapy and mental health resources should be a human right. It's so unfortunate that they're so expensive and costly. It was a real privilege for me that I was able to get to a stage in my life where I could find that space and then start to unravel some of the wounds and trauma that not just I experienced, but I inherited from my parents and who inherited from their parents. The legacy of generational trauma, especially within Asian American communities, cannot be overstated. And I think it's really unfortunate that therapy is so stigmatized, especially in our community and in communities of color. And that's not even addressing racism. By stepping out of your door every day, you're bound to endure racism, and that just is a re-traumatizing of all the past racism that you have experienced. So I think it's really important for everyone to have that safe space. My therapist, just in allowing me that space to talk about my feelings, the more I did that, the more I believed in my instincts, the more I started to understand. It was almost like a jigsaw puzzle of how my adult life was very much dictated by who I had been as a child and how the world had received me when I was a child. We receive so many of our blueprints early in life, and until we consciously look at them, we are powerless to break them. Those patterns just replicate over and over again. And so I think my therapist really freed me, gave me the freedom to build a new life that was untethered to those early blueprints. And I would wish that for everybody.
So besides the judge and the therapist, who are some of the mentors or friends that are instrumental in helping you in this process?
I mean, so many. I would go back as early as my public school teachers. Public school teachers are the frontline heroes of our society because they're just not enough public resources to reach every child who needs it. And in each public school classroom, the teachers are really balancing a myriad of tasks, not just teaching, but also counseling and identifying at-risk children who may need more support. Public libraries were another huge one, a place where I found my love of books, where I used books to teach myself English, where I really felt safe. I reflected at a librarians conference recently that it was shocking. I was scared of everyone in uniform because they represented authority and thus posed a risk of reporting me for deportation. But I never felt unsafe in a library. I never felt unsafe talking to a librarian. And I never even thought about why that was. It was just such a natural and comforting and protective place for me. And I'm sure that's not by accident. Having since talked to the librarians at Chatham Square Library in Chinatown, I know now that it was not an accident. They very much know what they are doing for the community and are very cautious to ensure that it is happening the way it is, that children feel safe there. And beyond that, just my writing mentor, Hilary Frey at Huffington Post, put me in touch with my agent. I took some writing classes at Catapult and Sackett Street, and those classmates were really encouraging because to confess, I think everything that I write needs to be deleted immediately. That's just my instinct. And it wasn't until those classes where the teachers gave us 5 minutes to write something, and then we had to immediately read it out loud right then, that I experienced a degree of vulnerability that foreshadowed what I felt putting this book out in the world. But it was the response of those classmates who said, you need to keep writing this. This is good. This is worthy. That's important. We all need to hear that at some point. And those classmates really made a world of difference for me.
Did you get any advice from other authors who wrote books before and they give you some advice about how to do a book like that? Because it's very different than writing a journal or writing articles.
I didn't know any authors before I started writing. I know some people write fan mail to authors, but I was just so intimidated by the whole world and again saw every book as holy that I just didn't. But since I have met some authors it's just wonderful to have a community of authors, especially authors who are women of color, and they warn me early and often that if you're a woman, you're a person of color, if you're from any sort of marginalized community and you're in the public sphere, you will get hate mail and you will be targeted for attacks. And just having people tell me to be braced for that and know that it was coming helped a lot when they inevitably came regularly.
Wow.
And it's sad, right? It's hard to read some of that mail and not be disappointed in humanity, but then to have a network of authors who are also dealing with similar things day in and day out and just trying to cheer each other on and remind each other of everything we have accomplished has made a world of difference. But the other tip that I got from Hilary, she told me to finish my book from the entire manuscript before I let anyone in publishing see it. And that's kind of odd advice. A lot of people sell, especially nonfiction, you can sell on proposal. And I didn't know anything. So I was like, well, Hilary told me and I don't know anybody, so I'm going to do it that way. But I'm really, really grateful that I did, because I have since met authors who sold their book on proposal, they're first-time authors, and then they had 2 months with a full-time job to write the book. Or the editor who bought their book, by the time they finished writing it, the editor had left and they had no champion in the publishing house. Or the publishing house had a really strong vision of how their book could be or should be. And being a first-time author, they didn't know how to defend against that and just got kind of shepherded. And I think that's particularly likely, again, when you are a woman of color and in some ways the industry wants to co-opt your brand and your work and your story. So I got incredibly lucky. And that's why I say the number one factor was luck, because I had a team of people who really believed in me and gave me the right advice that I needed as I was muddling around really in the dark, trying to delete my book.
What would you tell your younger self, that little girl in Chatham Square Library? What advice would you give her?
One of the biggest memories I have of being in that library was that even though people around me looked like me, I didn't see many Chinese Americans in books. Joy Luck Club was really big in the 90s, and that was it.
20 years ago.
Yeah, that was about it.
Yeah.
And it wasn't a children's book. I couldn't really read it at 7 years old. And I just felt really lonely. Like there was something wrong with me. And whenever Asians were depicted, especially in the 90s on TV, it was a caricature. So I felt like I was ugly, I was bad, I was illegal and unacceptable. And even my beloved books rejected me because I was not in them.
Mm.
And so what I would tell little Qian is that you are loved and worthy and deserving. You are not alone. You are not your status. And it is not your fault that you can't find yourself reflected anywhere. And you will make it out. It is, as my mother always told me in those years, it is temporary and you will make it out. And so just having that sense of hope, that sense of worthiness, I think makes a huge difference to any child. And it was really toward that vision of a new immigrant in Chatham Square Library coming across my book that I finally said, okay, I will put it out in the world because that person deserves it, not because I deserve it.
Congratulations on such an accomplishment. Completely can relate to your story there. But I am curious, how did you come with the name of the book?
Oh, yeah, so the initial title for this was not Beautiful Country, it was something else. And then my agent said it's good to go with, something, my initial title was too long and actually didn't make a whole lot of sense. So we tried to come up with some other alternates. And Beautiful Country was a title on both of our lists as we brainstormed. And so it's actually a direct translation of the Chinese word for America, which is 美国. And we thought that it perfectly encapsulated the ironies of how America is seen on the international stage, what draws so many immigrants to move here, and then some of the contradictory realities that immigrants find once they are here.
Hi, thank you for being here. So much of what you've said has resonated so deeply with me. I'm just curious to hear a little bit about the rapport you had with your editor, what that process was like, some struggles, the way in which maybe they shifted the work from what you had originally drafted.
Again, I was very lucky. I had an editor that I worked really well with. And again, I think it was really fortunate that my book was already written because when we had that initial call, she showed that she saw through the text what I was trying to do. And that in turn shaped her vision for shepherding it through to publication. So we didn't actually change a whole lot. There were times where I had to have frank conversations with her about how, so the blurb on the jacket, how that was written. We had very, boundary drawing conversations, not because she crossed any boundaries, but because we wanted to be very careful with how this book was marketed, like using the word illegal was something that we really wanted to make sure we did not do. That undocumented was, or without status were the terms that we would use.
Yes.
And I, again, was lucky that I ended up with an editor who was conscious of all of that already. And so much of that, I think, came from the fact that the text was there. And so the people who were drawn to it were ones who just naturally resonated with the story.
Hi, I'm reading your book or listening to it. I haven't finished it. But I love your relationship with your mother and your father, and I'm just wondering, what they said about the book?
I was terrified of showing them the book. In fact, when I was writing the book, and every time I thought about them reading it or responding to having it out in the world, I just could not write. I just shut down. That's why I had to keep pivoting to my judge's line about, you won't show this to anybody. It'll just be passed down to your grandchildren when you die or something. That was what got me through. So it took me 6 months to find the courage to tell my parents about the book deal after it happened. And luckily they didn't consume much social media or American media, or they would have seen it. And I'm lucky in that sense. But when I finally found the courage to tell them, those of you who have read the book will feel the pain in my heart when I heard her say this, my mother said, "So you want the entire world to know what an awful mother I was?" And that's totally understandable because I think it's probably every parent's worst nightmare for their child to write a childhood memoir, especially to this degree. And then in Chinese culture, especially, and then with my father having been from a dissident family and having been persecuted for that status, it was really triggering for them. And they were just terrified. Added on top of that was even the fear in me that once the book was out, ICE might come after us to deport us. I still thought that might happen. And I'm a lawyer. I'm supposed to understand the system and know rationally that will not happen. And I knew that rationally, but still deep down that fear lived inside, and I felt very protective of them. So I thought one way to protect them from even further fear was to keep the text of it from them. So they wouldn't know the details, like how much I shared. Maybe they thought it was just about my childhood and I didn't reveal that much about them. And so I just my mother was asking to read it from the time I told her about the deal. And I just said, "Oh, I don't have access to the book." So I was like, "The editor's a jerk. She has it. She won't let me have," like such a bad lie, so transparent. But my dad was like, "Oh yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's not." I was like, "Great." I bought myself another,
2
9
months.
months. Yeah, exactly. So on the morning of September 7th, I presented them with the book. And when my mother opens it, she bursts into tears, just seeing it in physical form. And my dad, like me, flips to the very end, reads the last sentence. I always do that with books. And he was like, "This is a good book. I like this book." The last sentence actually says, "Thank you, thanking my parents for giving me everything out of nothing." So I'm fortunate that was
The last sentence.
may have planned it. But then I thought they wouldn't be able to read it. They said it's too painful for us to revisit these years. And I was like, I totally understand. I can't tell you the number of times I cried writing this book. But of course they couldn't keep themselves from reading. And later that day, my dad texted me and my husband and said, "I feel healed by every page. And I'm crying into the book, but I feel a sense of healing." And so when I finally told them about the New York Times bestsellers list, sure, again, that ICE might come after us. I was like, oh my God, now they definitely know about the book. My father said, "Good. Now there's nothing we're afraid of because it's out there. We're not waiting for anyone to out us." And I realized then that at age 34, I was still waiting for permission from my parents to feel safe. And I got it. And so now every time we get together again, it feels really like we are all lighter people because we are not tiptoeing around this past that we never let ourselves acknowledge or talk about, which is so common, especially in Chinese families. And we are free to build a new future that's not tied to these secrets.
So writing a book actually probably saves a lot of money in therapy bills too, right?
Although putting out the book required a lot of therapy.
Yeah, true. But it was all worth it.
So I really hope that, yes. Oh.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. Michelle Wu is the first Asian and female mayor in Boston. What message do you want policymakers to take away from your book? And what else needs to be done for more progressive Asian Americans to make inroads in politics and in other areas of American society?
I can take the second one first because it was a very difficult thing for me to grasp when I became a litigator, which in many ways demands you to do everything that's contrary to what my Chinese mother told me and my Chinese father told me, which was to keep my head down and not draw any attention and not make any waves and not take any sides. It's just so hard to ignore that voice. It's been planted in our heads
For 34 years.
Yeah, exactly. From so early on, because for our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, that speaking up was dangerous. Like the government would come after you and you could literally die. And I am privileged, and many of us now are privileged to not have to face those risks, but it's still hard to accept that. But going into law, going into politics, requires you to take sides and stand staunchly. And Michelle's a great example of that. And we have luckily many great examples and inspirations of that. But being able to stake out a claim, even if it's not the most popular or maybe it's a new policy or idea, is crucial in making those advances and inroads in politics. And the other is coalition building. I mean, I see a lot of commonalities and in our bonds with the Black American community. And it's just that white supremacy is so embedded in our culture that Asian Americans and Black Americans are often pushed to opposite sides when we align in so many ways. And there's so many ways in which we could support each other and bolster each other. And I see a lot of strength in building bridges in that direction. There's a lot of work left to be done. And I hope to be part of that work in the future. And the first part of your question was, now I'm forgetting. I answered it. Okay, good. I always want to make sure you answer the questions because in court you'll get yelled at.
So I hope all of you can really get to read the book. I think when you read the book, you will feel really touched by the book. It's really a moving book. It's only covered her 5 years of her time, from her 7 years old to like middle school, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I think there's a lot more book coming out in the future. From her after middle school, there's a lot more to talk about, I'm sure. So anyway,
Parents will be excited.
I want to say, I present to you a beautiful country and a beautiful soul. Qian Julie Wang.
Thank you so much.